finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Doctors May and Tim Hindmarsh.
All right, this is going to be fun. We have a couple amazing guests today. The first, well, not the first because they're on together, but first off, we have Tony Lyons, who amazingly just flew in from Rome, I think, the day before we recorded this. And he's the president and publisher of Skyhorse Publishing, a company that has over 10,000 books in print. Tony has fought the censorship of numerous books and recently Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s new book, The Real Anthony Fauci. And he's here with us today to discuss that book, along with
Sofia Karstens, and she is an activist who worked with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on his book, The Real Anthony Fauci, and it is a best-selling and, of course, the most censored book in America. Sofia also works closely with the Children's Health Defense California chapter on many projects, so we are super excited that we got them both together on the podcast, and you guys are going to love this, as usual. So hang on, here we go.
Well, kids, buckle up the seatbelts and make sure that your hands are firmly inside the car because the roller coaster is about to leave the station. Yes, this is exciting. We are discussing the book, The Real Anthony Fauci, with two total insiders when it comes to that book. We have Sofia Karstens, who was a research assistant and editor, etc., for Bobby Kennedy in the writing of the book, and Tony Lyons from Skyhorse Publishing, who actually had the gonads to publish the book. We're going to talk about the censorship that they went through and how, even in the face of essentially no standard publishing promotion compared to what you would have with a big publisher, the book blew up. And trust me, I'm about halfway through it. It is a mind blower. So welcome, Sofia and Tony. We'll start with Tony. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to this point.
Sure. So I'm the president and publisher of Skyhorse Publishing. We've been in business for 15 years. We've published about 10,000 books during that time, many of them controversial books. We've been Bobby Kennedy's publisher for the last 10 years. Have published, 4 books with him. And, this, I think, The Real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health is the most important book that I think we've ever published. And it's the most important book for people to read now because it outlines just abominable corruption at the highest levels of government. That there's collusion between the pharmaceutical companies and Dr. Fauci and other people in the U.S. government who are just trying to extract money from the American public at the expense of public health. And, this last 2 years shows you what can happen when they do that 1 million people in this country died. And it was really just about money. It was about corruption.
Yeah, it's really mind-blowing because, we started out, May and I, we've worked almost exclusively in outpatient COVID clinics since the dawn of the pandemic. And we saw a lot of things change. I mean, our opinions changed drastically. I mean, initially when I saw what mRNA technology could potentially do, I was like, wow, this might, we might have cancer vaccines. And so, we were initially on board. We got vaccinated very early. Because at that point, I didn't really know any better. And then eventually, as this just evolved, and what really was the tipping point for us was, we worked in urgent care and we just saw people like filling the urgent care with vaccine side effects. I mean, I worked in primary care for 30 years, vaccinated, thousands of children and would see maybe 1 or 2 vaccine side effects a year, if that. And we were seeing, 10 of them or 20 of them a day. Like, it was absolutely staggering. And so we just, pumped the brakes and we're like, what the heck's going on? And then we met Peter McCullough. We interviewed him for our show. And all of a sudden, these scales, as they say, were falling from our eyes. So just really, really crazy stuff. Sofia, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in this stuff.
Yeah, I agreed with Tony completely. I think this is one of the most important books anyone can read right now. I worked with Bobby on the book and then worked very closely with Tony on the book. So intimately involved with all of the information therein and what ended up to be in and what ended up not making it in, only because we couldn't write a 22 encyclopedic volume, a tome, even though it's already a tome. But the reason I think it's so important is sort of what you were just alluding to, the scales falling from your eyes. I think a lot of people, and I encounter this a lot with physicians and good people. They're good physicians. It's not like they're not good at their jobs, and it's not like they're, corrupt and part of, any sort of, Machiavellian scheme. But I think that it is a tendency to say, well, I didn't see it, so therefore it didn't happen, or it didn't happen to me. That's not what I'm witnessing. Because in the bubble of the orthodoxy, that's the way it's orchestrated, right? So in order to be able to say, I've gotten into conversations with physicians across the country and the world who say, well, how many people do you know that have experienced personally? 14 at this time. This was 3 weeks in, right? People who had been hospitalized with, like, at that time, it was the stroke, the neuro side effects. So strokes, brain bleeds, things like that. And I said, how many people do I know personally? 14. And he was like, well, we're not seeing that. And I said, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. Just because it didn't happen, that's turning your head while your neighbor's dragged away, right? Like, you're telling me that you're not seeing it. And instead of being a true scientist and saying, well, wait a second, what they're seeing over there doesn't reconcile with our data here. Great, let's call for more science. Instead, you're saying, no, let's dismiss that. And not only that, but persecute those people and make them crazy for reporting something that's different than what you're seeing. That's the antithesis of science. That's the antithesis of first principles. That's the abandonment of true medicine, practicing true medicine. So, the idea that people are not only not seeing because they're kind of in their little echo chamber situation, but also are very resistant to hearing even that there might be some other experience happening outside their bubble. I think that's one of the reasons that this book is so important, because it really does start to unveil not just what's happening right now, but also we go back 5 decades to the architecture and the architects. We've been asleep at the wheel for a very long time. And so it explains all these tracks that have been systematically laid over 5 decades that got us to where we are right now. And I think for people to start to grapple with accepting the really depressing reality that we're standing in right now, they need to see the bigger picture. Because if you just show them the slice right now, they can't handle it. And that's evident when you try to bring it up with people, right? They're like, I can't, this is too upsetting. I can't hear this. Okay, well, we can put our big boy pants on and maybe like confront reality, but people don't, and they don't want to. And as we were discussing about before we came on camera, that largely is also a result of the desire to continue to keep comfort over a choice that might require a sacrifice, which people in this country have a very hard time with because they've never experienced anything other than that false choice. It is a false choice, but they don't understand that because they didn't walk across Latvia to try to escape. You know what I'm saying? They didn't live in Eastern Bloc. They didn't live in China. I'm sure those people wish that there was a good choice and a bad choice too, and that they could just comply and everything would go back to normal, but that wasn't actually one of the options. So I think that's why this book is so important, is it starts to unveil the true reality by giving a bigger picture of where we really are and how we got here.
Yes.
I'm just thinking back to, so a friend of ours, Dr. Peter Bregan, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with his book, COVID-19 and the Global Predators. We had him on, and he, at that point, I was like, wow, this really does, what you're talking about too. It goes back and unveils the whole planning out for years and years, the Great Reset, and sort of what they had already set in writing to plan for an event like this. And it just actually was, that for me was, I wouldn't say surprising. I mean, at that point, it wasn't really surprising, but wow, I was like, I didn't know that existed.
They ran simulations.
Yeah,
they ran full-on simulations, and they were headed up by Avril Haines, who was the direct CIA director, and the Gates Foundation. And every individual listed on their, for both Event 201 and for SPARS, but for SPARS is the one I'm referring to, the people at Bloomberg who were just under, who were responsible for that simulation, for that exercise, were all three-letter. Every last one of them.
Wow.
And that's Johns Hopkins, but it's Bloomberg, which is Pentagon affiliate.
It's amazing. Hopkins at the last pandemic in 1918 flu was really at the forefront of medical research. It took, believe it or not, almost, what was it, till 1922 or 1923 for the scientific community to actually admit that it was influenza and it wasn't some novel bacteria. People forget. We go, oh, it's the flu pandemic. They had no idea because they never saw influenza kill like that. But Hopkins has also now been on the forefront of some really wild stuff. I mean, they've been, like the whole SPARS thing, they headed that up. And for people that aren't familiar with that, that was a full-on simulation of a coronavirus that caused a pandemic. They go through chapter and verse, how using social media, how to shut down things, how there's going to be a vaccine, how people will be resistant to it, how to break down. I mean, and this was done in 2017, and it's out there. Like, you just search it and you can download all 85 pages of PDF and read it at your leisure, which would require a massive cocktail, but that's besides the point. So
we covered that in the book, and I think that's sort of the point. It really, to start to lift that veil so that people understand really where we're standing right now. This is not, crazy Looney Tunes conspiracy theory. That's not something we did with this book. We have 2,194 citations. This is all documented. Nothing is speculative. It is, there are certainly a lot of fringy, leaps that people can make of, like, therefore that means this, or that. We don't need to go down these rabbit holes. The dots that connect, that are right in front of us, are bad enough. We don't need to skip to crazy.
Well, and that's what
you can just.
Yeah.
And that was my question too, as far as, first off, to get this published. I mean, did you go straight to Tony with this, or was there a thought of doing a different publisher, or would people turn their back? Is it, have you worked together before? Because right away people think, oh my gosh, that's going to get squashed really fast by big names. I mean, I don't know anything about book publishing, but you hear everything getting squashed in internet, social media. So yeah, how does one go about first getting this out and getting it out there quickly and in a timely manner? And I guess when did you decide, to even write the book and get it published?
Yeah, so, I had published Bobby's prior books, so, it was the obvious choice. And when I heard about this book, I was incredibly excited to be able to publish it. I didn't know the extent of it when we signed it up, but as I started to learn and get more and more involved in the process, and it was an incredible process. So when people say that this book is misinformation, they miss what the real story is. And the story here is that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. worked on this book for about 10 months, something like 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, that they were literally hundreds of people helping with the research, with every aspect of this book. So this is incredibly well researched. And what I saw happen is something that I have never seen happen in 25 years of publishing. And that is that there was a total media blackout for a book that sort of came out of the gate selling more copies than any book in the country and any other book in the prior couple of years other than the Mary Trump book. So the book was selling so incredibly well, yet no newspaper in America wrote about it. No TV show other than Tucker Carlson would tackle it. Websites were banning advertisements. So all the big tech platforms refused to accept advertising for it. And, though you could buy it on Amazon, they were censoring it in every way short of taking it down. So what they did was they made it so that it's never recommended. So any best-selling book is recommended all the time when you buy any similar book. So if you try this, put in all of the other books that are sort of like it, that are in the same genre, that are, written by people who are mentioned in the book or people who gave blurbs, you will never have the Real Anthony Fauci recommended to you. And on the top, it says, for real information on COVID, go to the CDC website.
Yeah.
So then, we have sponsored ads that we run for all of our books. So we're in this program that automatically does sponsored ads for more than 10,000 books. So they won't allow this book in that program. So you can't run an ad for it even there. You have to really fight to find it. So you have to type in either Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s name or the full title. But there's no other way to get it. And then Barnes and Noble didn't take it in its stores for the first 2.5 months, even though we basically begged them to. Small bookstores all around the country refused to carry it, wouldn't even take orders for it. So this book was really censored, in every way you can censor a book. Even censorship conferences refused to allow us to be involved. So even organizations that are geared to protecting us from censorship wanted to censor this book too. So the level of detail there was astounding. And if you look at a book like this, so where the New York Times runs a hit piece against Bobby Kennedy, doesn't mention the book. At the same time, there were 10 other hit pieces run in all the major newspapers, in a half a dozen magazines, all of them geared towards discrediting Bobby Kennedy. Most of them not mentioning the book, and most of them essentially the same story, almost like they cut and pasted and changed some words. But it was almost like a protocol, like, how are we going to convince people not to buy this book? And Dr. Fauci refused to address it. So if you think about it, if you really have a better argument, you don't need to run hit pieces against the author simultaneously with the publication. You don't need to refuse advertisements. You could review the book. You could discuss the book. You could disprove it. So if Dr. Fauci wanted to go on 20 different TV shows, we all know that he could have gone on there. He could have had a whole panel of people trying to pick this book apart and make the argument that it was misinformation. But what Dr. Fauci was sticking to, which is what he's done all through this, so-called pandemic, is he's been saying, I am science. I represent science. And anything that I say is a fact. And if you disagree with me, even though he can disagree with himself, if you disagree with him, it's anti-science. And if you go to, and I would urge people who are listening to this to go on to some of the big tech platforms and look at their community guidelines. And their definition of misinformation is anything that contradicts what mainstream public health officials have said. So basically, there's no room for dissent. Whatever they say is a fact. And if you disagree with it, it's taken off every platform. And all of them are working together. And it's been very clear in case after case that people who are taken off one platform are then taken off other platforms. That, books that are, so even some of the shows that I went on to talk through some of the censorship of the book, even those were taken off of YouTube. So you can't even talk about censorship. You can't go to a censorship symposium to talk about the censorship of this book because it's so distasteful. It's so harmful to a specific narrative, and it shows you that there's a narrative, that there's a plan here, and that this contradicts that plan. And the people who are orchestrating that are scared to death that people will read this book.
And there's a word for what Tony's describing, and that's where we are standing. When you have a government that is working with corporations, in this case, big tech, and we have a president that stood up and publicly said it, that is, first of all, to censor civilians with the cooperation of a government and corporations to manipulate or control or censor civilians. That is the definition of a First Amendment violation. These private companies, there's a lot of people screaming about, well, I was kicked off, whatever. I was just kicked off Nextdoor, by the way. That's a new, it's a new bar. I know. I was like, really? I'm in social media jail all the time, but all these private platforms, they're within their right. They're private companies. They can do whatever they want. What makes it a First Amendment violation is that it is, as Tony said, you can look at their community guidelines and say, if this is against the government, and our president stood up and said, we're working with big tech to censor civilians, to effectively control civilians. So definition of a First Amendment violation. But also, if you look up fascism, this is also the definition of fascism. We're already standing in it.
Well, right.
And that should alarm every American.
No, that's exactly right. And people have all this kind of misconstrued ideas of what these things are, right? And it's like, they don't understand that totalitarianism can come from a whole bunch of different directions. And obviously in the United States, it's not going to be a completely instantaneous top-down, Bolshevik revolution where the communists come in and take everything.
It's coming, though. We're going to be the Bolshevik Revolution here in a minute.
Well, I don't doubt that. But of course, what you do is you play to your strengths. And when you have the world's biggest, most robust economy with these innovative companies, if you can co-opt them first, right. That's the the path of least resistance to control. And the thing is, and the companies love it because it gives them more control and more protection. It's like the CEO of Best Buy. I read an article that he wrote, or a quote that he did, 5-10 years ago. And he's like, personally, I think overregulation of businesses is crazy because it stifles innovation. He said, that's personally what I believe politically. But he goes, when it comes to running my company, I love regulation because it keeps all the little guys out of business. And that's exactly, that's what we have here times a million. You start this thing out with cute cat videos and people being able to show off their new refrigerator and share their lives with people. And it's truly an open platform. And then the algorithms get built and then the money starts pouring in. And then before you know it, you're doing 2 lines of coke and 3 needles of heroin a day because you're so addicted to the technology. Like it's just amazing to take a
to what picture. Agency do you go when it's turtles all the way down? You know what I'm saying? To what agency do you go when it's captured at every level all the way around? It's scary. I remember, this is such a silly analogy, but I remember back in the 80s, we used to have these things called after school specials. And there was one about like kidnapping, and it was a couple of kids that had been kidnapped and they were kept by these people or whatever in a town. And I don't remember the details, but what I remember was they'd found a way to escape, and they ran into the town, and the first person they ran up to was a police officer at a gas station that they saw, and the police officer was in on it, and he brought them back. And that's what I feel like we're in that right now. Like everybody thinks like, well, I'll just go outside. That no, there is no going outside the bubble. Like there is no, to whom do you go when it's at every outlet, it's going to bring you right back to being captured, you know?
Well, I think for me personally, I would have never thought this or said this 10 years ago, but just through what may not have gone through personally, just in the professional realm, and what we see now, and we see some successes, is it's exactly what Bobby's been doing for his entire life. It's the courts. It's the last hope. There's definitely corruption in the U.S. Justice system and in courts and all of those things, but there seems to be at least some rationality and some constitutionality that still exists there. The law or the decision that was made in LA, the LA County School District, where they don't have the authority to tell kids that they have to wear masks or be vaccinated. That was, I was just
a big one.
cheering. The one that I wanted to do, which was, if you work for pick a company, like a non-medical company, and they're mandating a vaccine, they're actually practicing medicine without a license.
That's correct. It's malfeasance. That's exactly correct. And that is how we will get them. It's malfeasance several ways. In a company, that's correct. That's also true in the schools. They're practicing medicine without a license. They're also unqualified they're paid for by taxpayers, at least in the public schools. So they're operating outside the scope of their contracts. So they are unqualified. They're not licensed psychologists. They're not clinicians. So they're practicing medicine without a license and operating outside the scope of their contract, and they're unqualified. So it's malfeasance three ways. So you're exactly right. And that is how we will get them.
But that was a good point that you made, that this is the kind of thing that Bobby's been doing for all of these years, that, big media wants to tell you that he's crazy, that he's a conspiracy theorist. But if you look at what he's actually done, as an environmental law professor, as somebody who helped clean up the Hudson River, starting a group of organizations that cleaned water all around the world and is still doing that, that he fought so hard to get mercury out of early childhood vaccines successfully, that he's brought over 500 lawsuits to sort of stop, government corruption and corporate greed, that this is somebody who we should be grateful for. Yet you can read in newspaper after newspaper that he's done something that's really terrible. And if you think about that and you look at the facts, you can see that this is government disinformation. This is, the government trying to make it look like somebody who's actually fighting for the people is actually harming them. So that's why people have to read this book and read books like it and start to kind of think out of the box of how does the world really work? What is really going on? And, there are all kinds of things that point towards corruption. And intuitively, everybody realizes in this country that pharmaceutical companies are corrupt. And if you look at it, you have to see that there's collusion between the regulators and the big companies. That how is it possible that, hundreds of thousands of people can die during an opioid crisis, and yet nobody goes to jail for it. Nobody's done anything wrong. It's sort of like corporations are people, so they can just kind of bake it into their P&L. And real people are dying, more than Vietnam, more than Korea. These are huge numbers of people dying as a result of the activities of pharmaceutical companies. And then suddenly COVID comes along and people are thinking, oh, now
Right.
they're really out to help us. So
These are convicted
intuitively
criminals.
we all know that just can't be true.
Yeah, well,
Sure.
thank you.
So, Almost. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Thanks for pulling the Band-Aid off the opioid crisis, because we've done several episodes. We actually interviewed Ben Westhoff, who infiltrated the fentanyl labs in China, which is a ridiculously amazing story just in and of itself. But the thing that's fascinating is if you, again, that started in 1980. The genesis of the opioid epidemic did not start with pharmaceutical companies. And I think it's really, really, really important to understand that. I think that there's definitely pharmaceutical company villains bigly with regards to opiates, but they're an easy target. It started with really terrible science and with doctors. It started with a 2-paragraph letter to the New England Journal of Medicine, where essentially a very poorly constructed study, which really wasn't a study, it was a retrospective analysis of 500 patients that were given post-surgical opioids, and they went back and they said, how many became drug addicts? And they went, 6. And then they made this massive, canyon-sized leap that therefore if somebody has a legitimate pain reason for pain, you can give them opiates and they won't become drug addicts. Well, that one letter got recited I think 600 and some times in the literature. It became a dogma, which was essentially just pulled out of somebody's rear. It became a dogma. And then you had 2 other things that happened. The pharmaceutical companies looked at this and they go, okay, do you know how easy it is to make opioids? It's like, we've been doing this for the last 3,500 years, since the Sumerians. So now we can be drug dealers, and we have an entire white coat army of people willing to push our drugs for us. And then regulators got involved. And by 2000, the Joint Commission, which is one of the regulatory bureaus that gives the stamp of approval to hospital systems, came up with pain is the 5th vital sign. So every single patient that comes in gets their pulse, their respirations, their blood pressure taken, and asked, "Are you in pain?" Are you kidding? And if you have the least,
and then they have that inane subjective list of what your level is with the dumb cartoon next to it. And meanwhile, by the way, the model is the same in terms of, you have to understand how to lie with statistics is always their game, right? So as you say, it always becomes dogma. But with 6 became drug addicts. Okay, when? 5 days later? Because did you stop the study after 5 days? So 2 weeks later or 2 years later, were they drug addicts? Because that's a surrogate endpoint, and you can't do that. So that's what happened with Gardasil. That you can't skip to the average age of cervical cancer, which is 56 in women. So they just make it up and go, well, it didn't happen within the first 7 days, which were the parameters of our study. So therefore it didn't happen. Okay, well, that's what we did with the vaccines, right? First of all, that's how we determined that they were safe and effective. But also, that's my favorite. I mean, okay, 95% effective. Okay, at what? No one asked that question. They knew exactly at what, and it wasn't transmission or infection. So, but also they ended the trial as soon as a certain number of people had contracted COVID. So the other 40,000 people, after 7 days, if they got COVID the next day or the next day or the next day, it didn't happen. So they don't include in these studies. And then it becomes dogma because people just keep repeating the 95% or the 6 people. And then it becomes lexicon. But there's no actual basis for any of that. It actually isn't even a study, as you said. And this is the same model. And that's how we ended up here with these vaccines. They just keep repeating the same dogma. And they don't even have to repeat it anymore. CNN can. That's the craziest thing of all. We just lost Luc Montagnier. But Luc was one of the people standing up along with many other experts in the field. You mentioned Peter. This is the most published cardiologist in the world. And literally these guys stood up and said, you guys hang on a second. We've got some concerns, and we understand that this is, complex, and we don't know a lot, and the studies are young, but here's our concerns. And instead, nope, they're completely discredited. And CNN comes on and says, this is the sock puppet parrot, And everyone goes, oh, yeah, no, I believe CNN. So wait a second. You'll believe the news over a world-renowned physician or expert in genetics and autoimmune, or it's baffling.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like kind of speechless just thinking of it as well. But it has been to us. I mean, we sit here and we watch this thing, obviously, as time goes on, and it's been unfolding in the last 2 years, and we hear from the beginning. You hear Peter, like you said, being the most published. He's seeing patients in real time. We're like, well, what are these talking heads doing, in Washington or DC or wherever their labs are? I mean, they're not seeing patients. They're not seeing what we're seeing on the front lines.
And they're funded by the very industry they're charged
right.
with regulating, and they're funded by a vested interest. That's interest in bottom line, in return on investment, and it's a corrupt system. Again, all the way back to who gets funded or who gets destroyed. Which is also in the book. We cover that in the book. And as Tony just said, it's a really important point to remember that, Bobby was named the hero of the planet for his work. And they fought like crazy when he was going after polluters. And he was named hero of the planet because that's an accepted activism, right? So like he's allowed to do that, but he's doing the exact same thing also to protect the people. There's nothing in place right now that protects the people. Agencies certainly don't protect the people. They protect their corporate interest. So we have a human who's standing up at his own peril. He gains nothing. These people have everything to gain. These corporations and these entities have everything to gain. Bobby has nothing to gain, and in fact, everything to lose. And he has lost. He's done this at his peril and at his ruin. And yet he continues to stand up. And he was right about all these other things. So why are you all of a sudden, the same thing happened to Peter, right? Why are you all of a sudden discrediting this person who has been right all along, whose only goal at his own cost and high cost has been to protect people and humanity? And I think that's, you have to consider the source in your equation of who you believe. And what Tony said earlier is exactly correct. These people who carried the torch forever for like the big bad wolf, pharma, they're awful. And then all of a sudden, but I'm sure this is fine. Why? What in your history of life on this planet makes you think that this is different?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to leave soon, but there was one sort of last point that I wanted to make, and that is that I was having a conversation with a very smart friend of mine, and he was bringing up some points like this one. So he was saying, well, if you're right, why is there so much consensus? Why is it that so many people all around the world disagree with your point of view here and the point of view that is covered in Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s book? So, one of the things that you said before was that, some statement or some bit of science can be taken out of context if it's beneficial to a specific narrative. And then what you do is you protect that at all cost. So all the doctors who come out and disagree with that, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, people like Dr. Robert Malone, Dr. Peter McCullough, they come out, and these are really senior people who've written hundreds and hundreds of peer-reviewed studies, and they come out and they're totally canceled and they're taken off the internet. So you can't find their studies. So then you say, well, nobody disagrees with this. And when it comes to a book that includes dissent, then they go after that book and the author of that book in every way. So even when the Real Anthony Fauci sold 95,000 copies in the first week, it was more than any other book in the country by thousands of copies. And it didn't even make the top 5 on the New York Times bestseller list because everything in this area is so well controlled. So they just knocked it down. So you can go to NPD Bookscan and you can see that the sales that week, that this book was the #1 book, and the Times lists it as #5, doesn't review it, doesn't accept advertisements for it, runs a hit piece against the author. So this is a program to stifle dissent so that they can then say, the author or these scientists or these ideas, they've all been discredited. And then people think, well, it's obviously a conspiracy theory because there aren't any doctors and scientists coming out disagreeing because I can't find them anywhere. So, but to leave you with one hopeful thought, that is that this book has sold more than 1.1 million copies now. So, to some extent, the program isn't working. So people are actually smarter than the people who are constructing these disinformation and misinformation campaigns think that they are. So they're going out and they're finding the alternative shows, the podcasts, the radio stations, the new platforms that are springing up. And they know not to believe what they hear on CNN, not to believe what they read in the New York Times, not to believe that the number one best-selling book on the New York Times bestseller list is actually the best-selling book, because it's easy to prove that it isn't. So more and more, I think people are understanding what's happening in this country, and there's a rebellion that's taking place, and we're all part of it. This book is the poster child for that rebellion, and I think it's going to keep on going, and that the future is going to look really bright.
I love that.
Thanks.
I love that. Thank you so much for being here. We know you have to run, but thanks, and we will make sure to highlight that and get everybody getting a copy of that book. And where would they be able to find that now, since it's, I mean, still mainstream bookstores, Amazon, they're going to be able to get their hands on it that way?
Yeah, so fortunately, the best place to get it is barnesandnoble.com, amazon.com. Even Walmart and Target are carrying it now. So those are the places. What they've done is they want to take away part of the narrative. So if you totally make the book not available, then the entire world comprehends what's going on more clearly, more easily. If you mess around with the algorithms, if you take out the ability to advertise, if you play all the more subtle games, then people think, oh, that's just a conspiracy theory. Nothing's actually happening.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And I mean, we see it here in rural America. I mean, the people, like lay people that aren't in medicine, I mean, they have their blinders like off. They know it. They see all this going on. They see people like Dr. Peter McCullough being silenced, Dr. Hazen, for instance, who's published on the microbiome and the use of the big, ivermectin and how it works.
We're on a podcast. We can go ivermectin.
It just gets pulled right away or censored by all the social, and they're like, well, this is happening to real scientists and doctors, and then they're the experts, then something bigger is going on. And so we turn our head left and right to our neighbors, our patients. They're, at least in our neck of the woods in part of America, they know that there's something bigger is happening in government and in these powerful organizations to try to silence it. And it frightens me as a doctor and a scientist, because, Tim and I were actually 2/3 of the way through the book, The Great Influenza, when the pandemic hit. We were commuting to work and listening to it. And, at that time, and science used to be, everybody with differing opinions and hypotheses would put forth their ideas and refute one another and test each other's theories and say, no, I think this is going to work, to develop antibiotics for pneumonia or how to get, deal with the flu. And it was challenging each other's ideas, and they allowed the differing opinions to advance science to better people, the world. And now it's just the opposite. And it's frightening because of who's controlling.
How were they funded in 1918? I think that's a critical piece to that puzzle.
Hey, let me just say one last thing. I just wanted to say, thanks so much for, being brave, and for having this show, and for, tackling these kinds of issues. And I'm so grateful to have been able to be on this show. And I hope that you guys have incredible future success.
Thank you so much, Tony.
Thank you so much.
So we are going to continue with Sofia. I think it's really interesting, though, when you bring up the book, The Great Influenza. It is a tremendous book. incredibly well researched and tons of really cool insights. But it's interesting, right? How were they funded in 1918? How was Johns Hopkins funded? How was Rockefeller University funded? How were they funded? Because they weren't funded by drug companies.
And that was all private money.
Right.
Exactly.
It's also, certainly there's always been the chance for corruption when you're looking at organizations or corporations. But what I find interesting is the redefinition of things like even the word science. Oh, the science says. You know what? Here's the thing. It's still called Newton's theory of relativity, right? Science is not a thing and it's like, oh, settled, we can all go home. Like, that's not how that works. It's a process, and it's often conflicting, and it's often irreconcilable. And the answer to that is we call for more science, not, well, this doesn't match what I have over here, so we're going to just dismiss and then censor the other side. That is not science. That is a narrative. And I have a client who was on, I live in California. So I have a client who was on the advisory board, the state advisory board at the beginning. He's a physician. He's actually particularly an epidemiologist. And I will not out him on this show, but he was one of the individuals who was advising Gavin Newsom and the others at the very beginning of the pandemic on the masks. And it was way before, even though certainly if we knew back in 2019 their agenda was the vaccines, then certainly there were individuals that knew. But at that time, they were not being discussed. So this was just a conversation about the masks. And he and 30 of his colleagues all said, all right, here's the deal with the masks. Masks they protect against particulate. So like in one case, like asbestos, or if you're on a construction site or whatever. And surgical masks are designed to protect against a secondary bacterial infection. So let's say you're having surgery and your surgeon, in order to avoid breathing or spitting into an open wound, that is to protect against that bacterial infection. Virus, it's like catching a mosquito with a fishing net. First of all, the size, it's thousands of times. It's just literally useless. The only thing you're preventing is a very small percentage of the actual droplets, moisture droplets, in which live, because this is an airborne, very, very small percentage of the virus to begin with. So it's like a percentage of a percentage, and it's fairly useless. The downside of wearing the masks, and they went through, strep, secondary bacterial, literally just, and by the way, whole states had to shut down because of strep, and they didn't report that. So across the board, they said, he and 30 of his colleagues literally said, here's why this is a bad idea. Here's all the science behind it. We all are in agreement. And he said, Gavin Newsom looked him right in the face and said, we're doing the masks, figure out a way to get behind it. Which means what we have is policy dictating science, not the other way around.
Well, and exactly. And the more they said science, the
Right.
more you know that they're just full of shit.
It just made me think of our son, who is intelligent, and he is in aerospace engineering, but he Googled, he's like, okay, what's the size of a virus particle? What's the size of the filter of a mask? Right. And, within 15 minutes, he'd figured out, he had figured out that, this is not meant to prevent me from getting anything and inhaling a droplet. And, then he proceeded to take his vape pen and blow, smoke right through the mask and make a mockery of the thing. But
right.
The fact that you're right. That they can make policy, and you're right, try to shape the science and the narrative of what people are hearing. It's like, oh, well, the government, Newsom says this, therefore that must be the science. And you see people walking through the woods, literally where we live, on a hike with a mask on because they're afraid of the air.
California is the beta test state, so it's become really absurd when you see the person in their car by themselves with like 2 masks and a face shield still.
Yeah, we got that.
And
we've got that
walking around outside, and I'm like, didn't we do this, guys? Like, we did this. Like, this really, it's, come on.
Or how about if you're the director of the NIAID and you have supposedly 4 shots and you wear 2 masks every day and you get COVID and it's Omicron and you're a very fit 82-year-old and you get Omicron, which is for the vast majority of people, not even a bad cold, and you credit the vaccines because it would have been worse, which is just imaginary thinking. That is akin to going to a faith healer and having them pray for you.
Circular logic,
and
right? I wore the green socks and I didn't get cancer. So.
And your cold got better 4 days later. It's like, well, was it the cold? I mean, it just, and then and then the coup de grace for me with that was he takes Paxlovid and gets sicker from the Paxlovid than he did. I mean, COVID came back, he got rebound. I mean, and Paxlovid is the Austin Powers of medications because they take an old HIV drug that didn't work for HIV and repurpose it for this.
Right.
And then the insanity of, oh, and by the way, the FDA will supersede all state governments and say that pharmacists can prescribe it. So we'll take a drug that has tons of drug-drug interactions, and we'll take somebody that's never prescribed a single drug. They know lots about drugs, but they don't go, what if we stop this one? What's it going to do to your blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera? And we'll let them prescribe it. Okay, that makes sense.
What the recommendations have become, and we understand the origin of this, but what the narrative that people are spouting and accepting, and that's what's just so Looney Tunes to me, is not based on first principles of any kind. It is the reverse engineering of an a priori conclusion, which, as I said, is basically, I wore the green socks and I didn't get cancer. So that's what we're going with.
Yeah.
No,
right.
but that's,
and people are repeating it.
But
absolutely.
As if it makes sense.
But the thing is, there's something about this that's really hit me in the last through probably the last just several months, is that we try to say that humans are like, that we're rational. Okay. Yes, we are rational to a certain degree, but we're much more inexhaustibly religious than we are inexhaustibly rational. And so, May and I are very open about our faith, and, we talk about it on the podcast, et cetera, et cetera. That's who we are. The show's about us calling BS. We call BS on ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. But people that don't have a formal religion, they'll make one up. And
right.
And that's what this has become. This has become this.
I say that all the time. It's these people's religion. And it's really, and it's also existential for them. You also do have to realize these are, there's certainly a spectrum of from completely aware of what's happening and fine with it, and completely snowed, and everything in between. But I think a lot of the people who should know better, I think that's a spectrum too. And I think that some of them, it is existential. And I think it's, they have medical school bills. They just barely got their feet in the door at some institution. They've spent their whole lives trying to, do what they're doing. And I think the idea that the foundation just got ripped out from under, that you just told them that's their church. So it's really, and again, it's an echo chamber. So they could even go, well, I need to go and do my own research. Well, yeah, but again, like the cop that brings them back, you're doing your own research in an echo in a bubble, in a vacuum. So you don't realize that you're just getting sent back to the same thing. And I think you're right about when you say that it's, for people who will cling to this. But I think it also depends on where the person's from. I think Americans have a particular deficit when it comes to, and people are fond of saying it's because Americans are dumb. And it's not because Americans are dumb. It's because they don't know what they're seeing. They don't know what they're looking at. So if you have a person who, is from, like I said earlier, Eastern Bloc, or from China, or from any South American country that remembers regimes, because our military industrial complex has been steaming into these countries for decades. And the model works just as well enslaving our own people as it does other countries. So if you talk to someone who's from a country who knows what they're seeing, the Armenians are the trifecta right now, because they remember genocide, they remember a totalitarian takeover, and they remember communism. So they're like, yeah, no, we're not confused at all about what's happening in this country. We're just putting our head down and like getting through this. But the reality is, you know, it's very, first of all, television has been the de facto education system in this country for 70 years. There's a lot of conditioning and preparation that can happen. And it's like, people don't realize even always that it's happening, certainly when you're young. But they're not teaching, for me, when I was a child, and into high school, and I was probably the last of the universities that actually taught things. But my generation, but we had something called required reading, and Solzhenitsyn was required reading. And in fact, we had a humanities course that was the literature side, and then we went into a whole separate teacher, a whole separate class that correlated the history. So we learned about 1917, and we learned about, you know, Lenin, and we learned about these events in history. We lived through the wall coming down, so we knew what the Iron Curtain was because we lived it. But wouldn't you teach it? Kids today think it's drapery. They don't have any idea what tear down this wall was and why, you know. So the idea that Americans are fed this lie from inception of their education, and then concrete is poured on that confirmation bias throughout life. So they don't actually know what they're seeing. So they'll believe the lie of like, if you just do this, everything will go back to normal. Everything, you can have everything you want. Just do this. It's fine. It's easy. A person from one of those countries knows better, because they know, you know, like I ask a person who had to escape with the clothes on their back, whether their choice was cake or death. It wasn't. It was Sophie's choice. I'm sure they much would have rathered to just make the easy choice and comply and everything would go back to normal, but that wasn't. Their choice was death, or in some cases, death. Do you want to die by hanging or drowning? That's your choice. You know, so I think Americans don't understand that the choice isn't, do you want to sacrifice or not? The choice is, do you want to sacrifice now, or do you want to sacrifice later? Because if it's later, it's going to be worse. And I think that's another thing that's really important about this book, is we do go into, you know, the mechanism that is driving this within the government. And we are looking at three-letter agency, and we are looking at a pretty substantial orchestration. And it's really hard for Americans to know what they're seeing, because they've never seen it before. They just didn't know what they were looking at.
Yeah, you know, it's fascinating because, you know, this almost inversion of the left and the right just blows my mind. I mean, I have no idea where you stand politically, and it doesn't matter to me a single bit, because there's principles that are bigger than these, you know, these left-right issues. It's called liberty, you know, and I think of people that were, you know, you would normally think of as sort of paragons of the left, you know, Bobby being one of them. I mean, an environmental lawyer. I mean, he took on the biggest corporations in the world. Or Naomi Wolf, who has been just fabulously courageous. And, you know, she was a Yale educated PhD hyper feminist. And she's like, you know, how can I fight for my body, my choice for my entire career, and say that a vaccine mandate somehow makes any sense? And
well, you nailed it, I think, when you say, you know, that it's an inversion, but I don't think it's an inversion event. And it's not the person. I am a recovering Democrat, but it's not like I woke up one morning and went, I totally believe the opposite of everything I've ever believed in my entire life. My values have not changed. I still feel the exact same way, but I woke up one morning and the line moved from over here to way over here, and these people went and dove off a cliff. And now, alarmingly, also, because there's lunatic fringe on both sides, right? Like, you're closer to crazy on this side. I don't wear the full uniform of crazy on either side. But now I'm okay. I guess I'm more aligned with this, but also Reagan would be a liberal Democrat by today's standards.
Well, and
So
JFK would be a Republican. I mean,
correct.
he was tough on communism and he lowered taxes. I mean, he was more Reagan than Reagan when he came into power.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you nailed it. I mean, it really is. It's an inversion, but it's not like everyone woke up and was like, oh, I'm going to change parties. Like that's, I think what happened. And to be clear also, the second, because there, like I said, there is lunatic fringe, right? There are these people that are maybe not the greatest. And because of relativism and because of them being like, here's our chance. If you think the second they get back some power, they're not going to turn around and be the same assholes they've always been. That's, of course they are. But for the non-lunatic fringe on both sides, if you look at the reasonable, I call movable middle, but the reasonable contingent, the reasonable contingent on the left has ceased to be reasonable. And therefore, as it turns out, I'm now aligned with the reasonable contingent on the right.
Right.
That's just the way it happened.
But it never ceases to amaze me. I was thinking about this morning about how even like, pick the most contentious issue in the United States, which I think unquestionably be abortion. There's still,
but that's by design too.
Of course it is, because it's divide and conquer. But at the same time, there's still a unit. I mean, and I don't want to get into the debate, but I do want to use it as an illustration for the fact that people on either side of that issue are often arguing for the same bigger principle, but don't recognize that they're arguing for the same bigger principle. The one side pushes, emphasizes bodily autonomy, which is a liberty issue, which I would agree with. The other side pushes the bodily autonomy and the uniqueness of the unborn child. And the thing is that what are you fighting for? You're fighting for liberty on both sides, and that is what we need to get back to. Then we can debate where the middle ground is.
It's always a convergence, and I think that's where that's why we have debate, is that nothing is black and white, right? Nothing's kick or death. So we are looking at complex issues, but I get this all the time when you brought up Naomi. Like people are like, oh, well, you can't be pro my body, my choice and be anti-vaccine. Well, no, here's where that's different, because everyone, as you said, it's like they're fighting for the same thing, but they don't know it. It's because everyone uses meme science and everyone uses meme arguments, but life is more complex than that. So something that sounds really good where everyone can go, yeah, that's it. Yeah, no, that's just dumb and simplistic and childish, not childlike, childish, if you think that it's not as complex as it really is. So the reality is that the difference between those two issues is one is discussing the convergence of a life and bodily sovereignty of an individual, and where like with human rights, right? Pick an amendment. Your right to yell fire in the crowded theater. Okay, well, that's where that convergence ran into someone else's right to have their safety or their autonomy or their sovereignty or whatever it was that they have protected. So in this case, we have the convergence of one individual, and where that intersects with potentially another individual, sovereign individual's rights. That's what you're arguing in the abortion argument. The vaccine argument has no such intersection. This is just an argument about government overreach and whether they can or cannot have control over your body.
Yeah, but the other side would say there is a convergence because I'm going to take the vaccine to protect grandma.
But we've proven that that's and St. Fauci himself has come out and said that it has no effect on transmission.
Right, but initially
that argument has now been eliminated.
Right.
It's been eliminated.
But initially it was like, do it for the good of your fellow man. If you're not getting vaccinated, it's
ridiculous argument.
Exactly. I mean, exactly. But that was the narrative. It's like, well, then you must have.
But the narrative is different than the fundamental. And that's why I'm saying it's more complex than just the meme.
Right.
So when you put the meme out, everyone goes, oh, yeah, this is that. It's the same. No, it's really not. And here's why.
Right.
There's a fundamental difference.
Right.
In a court of law, that is a fundamental difference.
And that's
and you can't.
Yeah, that's been my biggest contention in this entire thing, has been that two things can be true at the same time. even though they
Right.
look seemingly contradictory. So, for instance, the problem with the vaccine isn't that the vaccine does nothing. The problem is that it does what it's supposed to do very poorly, which makes it much worse than if it did nothing. And people don't understand that. So what that means is, yes, in early 2021, the vaccine may have saved some people's lives. There's no question of that. It may actually have reduced serious illness and death.
Right.
But at the same time, when you look at this, as you talked about before, the timeline, it may still end up, and I believe it is, to be the worst public health debacle in the
Right.
history of mankind. Both those things can be true. Grandma
Yeah,
could have
right.
been saved by the vaccine in May of 2021, and great
And die of,
right,
correct.
and great grandson could have been killed by the damn thing.
But I think that's also where we look at, and that's another reason this book is so important. If life is mitigation of risk, right? We all, I significantly reduce my risk of not being hit by a bus by not running blindfolded across the 405. I get to make my decisions based on my knowledge, presumably having all of the information. And if you want to look at COVID, for example, back when we presumably knew less, I am a healthy individual. I don't get sick. I don't, my risk of getting COVID critically was close to zero, honestly. Even if it's 0.001%, we can put trans fat on a thing at 0% and say if it's 0.001%, right? So I have a 0%. What are my chances of having an adverse reaction to the vaccine? Well, probably also fairly close, at least an immediate response. The downstream stuff's separate, but an immediate response, probably also less than 1%. Though by taking an action as opposed to an inaction, automatically that statistic goes up. So those two things are fairly, whatever. But then we look at the potential downstream effects, of which we know very little because we can't, as I said previously, create a surrogate endpoint. So is that risk for me, knowing my medical history and first of all, what's a risk for me, but also a risk for me may not be a risk for you, but a risk I'm willing to take may not be a risk you're willing to take. That's individual. So all of these things into consideration, I am able to make that choice for myself because I have access to all the proper information in order to be able to make that determination. What's criminal and what's happening is that people are not being given all the information. Like you said, there's ups and downs and cofactors and everything else. And, this, is it causing more harm than good? We don't know. What's your risk factor for this, that, and the other thing? There's a million things that come into this. And it's a needle in a haystack and it's unfortunate, but that's life and people have to make their decisions. But if you're being prevented from having access to all the information to be able to properly make that decision, that is criminal. And that's where we're looking at really unveiling why this is happening. Because as we need to create in this country agencies that are not part of the bottom line, that are not funded by the very industry they are charged with regulating, that are not worried about a return on investment, that do not have obligations to shareholders and stakeholders, that do not have fiscal obligations, so that we have something protecting the actual people. And right now, we don't have that. We don't have that. So that is, we can get rid of the Faucis and the Dasigs and the Collins and the Walensky's and the Borlas and everybody else. But it's going to be cutting off the head of the hydra, because what we have right now is a system that is corrupt, and it is greater than the sum of its parts and more powerful than one individual in it, any one individual in it. So no one's waking up and twirling their mustache in the mirror every morning. Like, this is a system that is bigger than people understand. So what we need to do is really start to dismantle the system and create a parallel opportunity for protection of the people that isn't monetary, that isn't interest-based. And I think that's where uncovering 5 decades of the architecture of where we're standing is really important for people to see where we are and how we got here, so that, first step in identifying a problem and in, realizing there's a problem is identifying that there is one. So for people to start to see where we went wrong and how we need to get back on track.
So where do you see this? Man, we could go, as with all of our interviews, we could go for hours, but to kind of bring this back around, Tony was quite hopeful just before he left us. Where do you see this end? Because I see some serious cracks in the dam starting to develop.
I do too. I feel very hopeful as well. I don't think it's going to be an overnight process, and I do think it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I do think we are looking towards the Bolshevik Revolution here in a minute, but I do think it is, if we can systematically start pushing back this tide, especially in the courts, and it is in the courts that is our last bastion of, even though there is, of course, we're dealing with a certain amount of capture, and we're dealing, like I said, nothing is perfect, but our system is really set up in such a way that if we can push back this tide, this is how we're going to do it. And I do also think at the end of the day, it's going to go one way or the other. There's no middle ground. We're either going to push back the tide or we're not. And I think the more people that can read things like this book, read things like the Real Anthony Fauci, read things and start to accept that this is the reality and we need to make some choices that may be difficult ones, and it may be uncomfortable for a little while, and it may be inconvenient for a lot of people. And for those who are unable, I sympathize with that as well. But for the people who are able, this is life. Life is not, like I said, it's not cake or death. It's Sophie's choice every day, all day. So for those who are able to recognize this and to start sharing things like the Real Anthony Fauci with people, I have had individuals who I thought were, I call them the lost contingent, who are in the lost contingent. And they're the people who you get into the weeds immediately trying to have a conversation with these people. They throw the memes at you and the parrot, safe and effective. So it's like that. Yeah. Okay. Well, and like you said, well, how come I haven't seen any? Okay. Well, that's how much time you got. Because if you have 3 weeks, I can educate you as to why we're standing here. Or please read this book and let's talk about it when you're done. And within days, I get the call. Oh my God, is this true? Oh my God, I had no idea. Oh my God, I'm on the wrong side of this. And so I feel like it is a really great tool to start to at least, you're not going to get people down off the fence by turning a fire hose on them. You're going to get people down off the fence by giving them a hand and going, step down now that you're here, but I think that the mistake that, our team has made is to sometimes turn a fire hose on people. And while the book is definitely a fire hose, it's digestible and it's manageable, and people can incrementally start to accept. So I have had conversations with people that I thought were completely lost because they read the book. I have had people reach out who I never thought would read the book and say, hey, I got the book and I read it, and do you have a minute to talk? So I think tools like this they give me hope and encouragement that we can turn this tide. Because like I said, we're either gonna or we're not. But if we can, I think it's gonna be because of the sane, clear, just the facts, ma'am, laying out of where we are and how we got here in a really manageable way for people. And I think that does give me hope, and that does make me feel like, we are historically resilient, even though most people alive today don't know it or remember it.
Yeah.
But we are.
I think that's true. It's interesting because I talked about the fence for a long time. And I said, I kind of see two sides to the fence. There's Fauci on one side of the fence. It's like, I am the science. Don't go against. And people are like, well, you lied to me and you've changed you flip-flopped more
right.
than a guy on the beach with flip-flops. And on the other side, they
Right.
see Trump, which they see as offensive, right? Which is like, I built the fence. The fence is beautiful. It's a big, beautiful fence. And the thing is, you there has to be there's nuance in there, because they want to hand down, but they don't want to fall back into this, I was lied to. And I think the government's I don't trust them. But then they don't want to feel like they're falling into something that they can't accept, for
Right.
whatever reason that is. And I know on our side, personally, where, we're a lot more, we've been conservative for our whole life, et cetera, et cetera. It's just that, I like Trump's policies, but rhetoric matters. Like how you do
Yes.
stuff and how you say things still matter. And
That's why I say it's tough. People don't, sane people, smart people, don't want to wear the full uniform of crazy on either side.
No.
And right now, the only two options they're being presented with is the full uniform of crazy.
Yeah.
So it's like, no, actually, we can open up this Florida debate and we can find nuance. We can find complexity. We can find contradictions and try to reconcile them, or call for more information to try to reconcile it. And in some cases, that may never happen. It may not happen in our lifetime, but that's the only thing we can do to get closer and closer to what actually may be the truth, or a swath of acceptability. It's the argument, you can't have security and privacy, right? You can't have both you fully. So finding the tipping point of where we have our privacy, but we're protected, is the job of individuals that we entrust to that endeavor, to that task. So the same thing is true when you're dealing with something like public health. Nothing is going to be black or white in this. There's going to be, it's always cost benefit analysis, but the cost benefit analysis shouldn't be actual cost at the expense of human lives. The cost benefit analysis should be the cost of human life, not the money.
Yeah.
So it's the wrong equation. We're doing the wrong equation.
Exactly.
Wow. So this is, my brain's going so many different directions, different thoughts, but we're so thankful and grateful for you guys to take the time and come on our podcast and share. And I know from the way things have been going on our podcast and feedback that this one is going to be an amazingly popular favorite episode. So thank you.
We're so grateful for you guys for having the courage to stand up and do this show. I can't tell you how many shows I've had to do where the person's like not on screen and change their voice, and because they don't want anybody to know who they even are. So the fact that you guys are out there on the front lines, we're so grateful, and keep swinging.
Well, we're those people that were weebles, if you remember those from was that the 80s? Yeah. We keep getting kicked down, but we pop back up like eggs, and we've been kicked a lot in the last couple of years. And so we don't care anymore. We believe in standing up for what we believe in truth. And so that's what the show is all about. So thanks again. This has been amazing.
Thank you guys.
I would love to just spray those books everywhere as best as I can. So anyway, any other way we can help, let us know. But we'll certainly link your information. Is there a certain website as well to look up as far as more information?
Yeah, so the California chapter of Children's Health Defense, we're here in California, which, as I mentioned, is the beta test state, and it is our team of brilliant, wonderful attorneys who are in the courts fighting this. And it's a lot in the schools because they're after the kids. That's so, it was the mask, and even back at the beginning of the year, I'm sure you saw the reversal of the remote learning. So those teams, we've got 25 lawsuits we're ready to file, and it requires funding, and it's a never ending, constant, like, we need to keep pushing in the courts. So the California Children's Health Defense link, which is the one that I sent you guys, is if anybody wants to go on and check out and see what we're doing, we have breakdowns of all of the stuff that we're working on out here, and also the lawsuits. And there's a donate button if people want to support. And if people want to support National Children's Health Defense National as well, but specifically California are the California lawsuits, which are the ones happening in the schools. And, that's the push right now.
Happy to we'll put that in the show notes and link it as well. Absolutely. So thank you again. It's been a great conversation. And, if you want to ever come back and update us on how things are going in the future, we'd love to have you.
Thanks. We would love to, and we'll make sure Tony can be there for the whole time. He won't be getting off a plane from Rome.
Exactly.
And we do have the Wuhan cover up is next.
Stay tuned.
Okay. All right.
Do you have a lot to say?
I'm not going to say.
Say?
We had a long discussion. I'm not going to say too much. I could go on for hours. Our own journey.
You need your own show. You need your own commentary show.
Yeah, I do.
Separate from the podcasts.
Yeah,
the musings of Tim Heinmark.
Yeah, I'll do it with Mark Levin.
Get off the phone, you big dope.
Yeah. So, anyways, it's. We really did get red pilled this last 2 years with regards to what went on with COVID. I think we were fairly open-minded. We were very receptive to the potential for mRNA technology as a whole, and specifically in vaccines and the COVID vaccine. What I have learned personally, just in reading literally hundreds, if not thousands of hours, I have learned a lot about virology, way more than I ever
learned in medical school.
Well, yeah, and lots about vaccines, what kind of things you can vaccinate against, which you can't. And, we've gone through that in detail. I think the interesting thing about this book is not so much that it beats up Tony Fauci, and I have no problem with people beating up Tony Fauci. That's not the issue. But really, it exposes more, I think more importantly, how the system works, how the system of research, of grants, of big pharma involved in grants, et cetera, how it works. And that really is the damnable offense. Mm-hmm. Fauci isn't so much, May and I have discussed this ad nauseum. Fauci didn't, get and keep this job for 40 plus years because he's a great doctor or a great researcher. It's a political job. That means he's a great politician. By definition, you don't stay in a political job for a gazillion years unless you're a tremendous bureaucrat / politician. And what you learn in the book is, yes, he understood the levers of power, in other words, dispensing money, and he understood how to crush people when they crossed him. And that's how you stay in that job forever. Talk to anybody that's upper level military, and they'll tell, or even lower level military, they'll tell you after you get promoted to a certain degree, once you're a general, it's essentially a political job. You're not really, you're not out there fighting wars anymore. You're not Patton. Those days are gone. So I would really encourage people, if for no other reason, to read the book just to kind of get a little bit of insight into kind of how a lot of these government agencies work, how they essentially collude with giant corporations. And then if you really want to lose sleep, this is just pharma. Like, you don't think this happens in the defense industry? You don't think that this happens in big agriculture? It's just, the system has really been, when you get a big federal government and you concentrate a lot of power in one or two hands, you're going to get a lot of corruption. It's just the nature of the game. And unfortunately, the people that stick around the longest tend to be the most tainted, because they understand how the levers of power work. They understand how the system works, and they can use it to their advantage better than everyone else. People of really high moral standard don't last that long and don't last in corrupt systems, because they either get eliminated from the corrupt system because the corrupt system sees them as a threat, or they quit because they don't want to be part of it. And it's that's just the truth. So read the book.
I'm just gonna, great summaries always. and I'm just going to hop in and say that's the real truth according to Tim Hindmarsh.
Right.
You could write a book on
Well,
that.
we could write a book, The Fake Anthony Fauci, not the real Anthony Fauci.
The real Tim Hindmarsh.
The fake Anthony Fauci. Because I am the science.
So
Are
yes,
you the No, that's the fake Anthony Fauci.
get a hold of the book. Absolutely. It would be nice to just kind of frisbee that across onto doorsteps, or not even frisbee, morning newspaper it onto doorsteps of people. But I mean, there's a more tactful way to bring up the topic and the subject than, as we said, fire hosing people. But it would be great for people to really read it, dive in, and just get an idea of the inner working. So
yeah, and the other thing I think that's really important is to understand that your doctor does not know jack diddly doo-dah day about how these systems work. Physicians
good point.
Physicians are really, really specifically trained in how to diagnose and treat illness in certain ways. Okay, that's it. They don't know how drug development works. We took 5 hours of on how to read studies, like a little tiny stats class
in med school. Yeah,
but nobody.
But in residency, we had to. It was more extensive because we actually had to do paper reviews.
Right, critical appraisal. In residency, that was
critical appraisals. It was very painful and not fun. So if you didn't like it, you learned how to do it in the briefest, quickest manner possible.
Right, which means you learn how to read the abstract.
We were still terrible at it. You read the abstract, so yes, we had a class in it. We were still poorly trained. Totally agree. Well, I think we wrapped this up really well. If you have, you get nothing more to say about that. We're done. So thanks for joining us this week. Obviously, if you like us, share us with your friends. Doing my little PSA, share this episode and dig deep back into some of the other really good episodes that we've done on this topic. And we look forward to seeing you guys next week.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS Free MD. See you next time.
While we try to keep BS Free MD as raw and real as possible, we can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bsfreemd.com.